The news carried itself through Wintertown like warmth filtering through a crowd around a hearth. Men who had kept their speech close as hands in mittens began to nod to each other openly. Women came up to the keep with baskets as though lemmas had been proved and now bread might rise again. The ragged banners on the walls no longer looked like a boast but a promise, and promises change how men walk. The wider north felt the shift too. Ravens returned with replies that were not yet oaths but were no longer evasions. The Riswells sent words about weather and roads and the difficulty of moving cattle, which in the north is to say, "We will see which way the wind blows and hope it's toward our fields." Torrance Square sent a plain note that tasted of iron in the mouth. "Send us nails and we will send you men." Deepwood Mott sent a gaunt letter in Robert Glover's rough hand that spoke of pines and snow as if both were kin and offered axes without talk of coin. John read them all at the end of long days with his fingers smelling of pitch and horse. He answered with care, resisting the urge to be either proud or pleading. There is a tone that keeps folk from feeling cornered. He found it more by listening to Winterfell than by searching himself. He kept his own name small on the page and he let the direwolf do the speaking where it could. He wrote Alisane Mormont of Bear Island not as a lord to a lesser but as one house to another with old stubborn roots. He asked for women who could teach boys to hold a shield so their arm didn't break the first time it took a blow, and for girls who could set a pot to boiling when the wood was wet and would not play fair. He walked the yards with Moore's umber and found places where the wind got under doors the way thieves learn houses by the sounds they make. He went to the kennels, emptied of Bolton's beasts, which had slipped into the woods like bad dreams, and spoke to the boys who had cared for them with a lowercase cruelty of pranks and starving. "We will fill these with hounds that hunt deer," he said, and the smallest boy looked up as if shown a new tool. Stannis stayed 3 days and left with a march like a blade's edge, though where he meant to cut was a question he did not answer aloud. He called Justin Massey to him in the hall and put papers in his hand and sent him downriver under guard to White Harbor and thence to Bravos. "Coins buy food and men," Stannis said, "and time when men are short." He gave the Red Woman a glance that was half dismissal and half dare. Melisandre stayed, not because Stannis ordered it but because the cold was a language she seemed to enjoy speaking around Jon. Sometimes he thought she looked at him the way a cat looks at a dark stare, curious about what moving through it will do to her whiskers. On the 4th morning after Stannis's departure, a rider came from the east with a face like frostburn and a message clenched in fingers that had gone black at the tips. The rider's cloak was trimmed with rabbit fur but did not keep the cold from chewing, and he had wrapped his mouth with a strip of cloth the color of bruises. He stamped without shame by the hearth while Jon broke the seal. The wax was pale, the impression poor, the hand in the letter thin and careful. Lady Barbary Dustin invited Winterfell's new lord. She used the title as if testing whether it would crack under her tongue, to parley at the Barrows before Barrowton. She would not cross Winterfell's threshold yet. She would not refuse to hear what he had to say either. Weather was mentioned and duty and bones. "Bones," Moore's umber said, when Jon read him the letter that evening over a trencher of venison so tough it needed a knife twice. "She likes to play with them. That lady keeps the stark bones as other women keep sewing. She hated your father. She loved my uncle," Jon said, and the words were less harsh to speak than he had expected, perhaps because he did not remember Brandon as more than the shape the world had given him. "Hatred can share a bed with that kind of love for a long time." "You'll go?" Davos asked. He looked as if he already knew the answer but wished to have it on the table where it could be moved about with careful fingers. "I'll go," Jon said. "Old Flint holds a spark stubborn as a vow. I won't ask her to hand me her anger, but I will ask her to hand me some of her men." He went with a small party, Moors and 2 umbers laughing at the cold as if it were a boy's trick. Davos with a face made for the sea but a patience that carried to the road. Alice Karstark wrapped in wolf fleece that made her look like a ghost of a queen in an old song. Sigorn at her shoulder, his quiet as steady as the snow's fall. Godry Faring begged him to take a round dozen Queen's men, but Jon shook his head. "Better to meet a woman in her own country as a guest than as a brand," he said, and if Godry took it as slight he tightened his jaw rather than argue. They went southeast along paths that were both old and new, old as wolves, new as men who had been murdered on them. The snow lay like skin drawn taut over ridges. On the second day, the wind shifted from knife to needle and stitched everything together with a hiss that clung to the ear. They came to the barrows under a sky the color of lead. The mounds rose from the plain like whales surfacing under sheets, old and watchful. The god trees were far to the north, but the barrows had their own hush. Lady Barbary awaited them on a rise where the land rippled like cloth thrown over something large and still. She dressed in good fur and good sense both. Her hair had threads of iron and her eyes the look of a woman who had counted more than coins. Behind her stood her men of the bar Rolands. Steady, cautious, with the muscle memory of horses and grain sacks both. Beside her stood Lord Ryswell. Anders sour, his beard thinning. He hunched in the cold and peered at Jon as if he would see Ned's jawline and spit. Barbary inclined her head just enough. "Winterfell remembers how to write," she said as greeting. "And the barrows remember how to listen," Jon said. He looked at the mounds and let the silence between the two houses be a measure rather than a weapon. "Thank you for meeting me." She studied him unabashed, as a buyer studies a horse's teeth. "You have his softness around the eyes," she said almost clinically. "Not his mouth." "Robb had father's mouth," Jon said. "I had other lessons. Snow's lessons." There was no spite in her tone, only inventory. "I hear your name on men's lips with 2 letters removed. Who asked those letters to step out of the hall?" "A king," Jon said. "By a pen that the North will honor if it honors anything Southern." "Stannis," Ryswell said, as if naming a goat in a dress. "Stannis," Jon agreed. "But I do not ask you to kneel to him. I ask you to stand with the North." "Against whom?" Barbary asked, bone-pointed. "Against winter? We are already standing. Against the Boltons? I watched your father bring my husband home in a sack of stories, and Roose Bolton smiled at the funeral as if milk had just touched his lip. I know the Boltons. I do not suddenly forget them because the snow has hidden their flayed men's banners." "Against knives that sit in chairs," Jon said, and her mouth almost tugged. He let the almost be enough. "Against Roose and his cousins and any man who thinks the North has no memory. Against hunger. Against the dark that will come out of that memory across the wall if we do not keep fires burning on more than one hearth at a time. I came to ask for men. Not now. Some now, yes, if you can spare them without starving your fields of hands to dig. But more later, when we take the Dreadfort." At the name, Ryswell made a noise like an old hinge. Barbary's face did not move, and for a time the only sound was wind combing the barrow grasses into lines that seemed like writing. "You would take Roose in winter," she said. "I would starve him and pull threads from his seams," Jon said. "The North is wide, and he is not a boy to run the trees like a deer. He must feed his men. We will let him feed them on their fear." "You speak as if others will feed yours," Ryswell said, and there was something like a test in it. "White Harbor sends grain." Jon did not say pies. "Deepwood sends axes. The Umbers send speed and sound. The mountain clans send men who can vanish into the white. Bear Island sends women who can kick harder than a stag. If the Bar Rolands send patience and horses that don't founder, I will take that as a gift. If Lady Dustin sends her counsel, that is worth more than iron in some fights." Barbary looked long at him, and Jon did not try to fill that space with promises. "Your father came here once," she said at last, voice level and unadorned. "He spoke of honor as if it were a coat you can always find on its peg even in the dark. I told him what I thought of his coats. He took my husband to war and left me bones that were not his. He never came to collect the bones of his own house when I held them as hostage against time." She blinked once, and in that blink there was a century. "If you take the Dreadfort and you ask me for the Stark bones, I will return them without you needing to ask twice. Not for you. For the Hall." Jon inclined his head. "The Hall thanks you. You may have 20 riders who know the marshy places," she said, "and 30 sturdy boys who have learned to keep their eyes open. I will not give you all my horses. The graves will spit bones if I do. You will send them back to me ill-spent, and I will send you better ones, and that is a pact I know how to keep." Her lips quirked. "And I will send you 2 men who know how to talk to Freys when you have a rope and a sack and want one to walk into the other." "Names I should know?" Davos asked mildly. "Not names worth writing, faces worth watching." She looked beyond Jon to the east, as if seeing the Dreadfort in her mind. "Roose will think to wait. He is good at it. If he were a woman, he'd have 20 children by now for all the patience in him. Do not let him wait at his ease. Patience likes to be bled a little," Jon said. "We'll see to it." When he took his leave, Barbary walked with him a few paces and then stopped, her boots printing the snow with a neatness that a housekeeper would envy. "The North will give you a trial before it gives you a feast," she said, not unkindly. "It has always been so. You have the look of a man who eats trials without making a face about the taste. That will help." "It's easier when you know what's in the bowl," Jon said. "It never is," she said. "But say it again when you need to believe it." She turned away without dramatics, the way a woman leaves a room that will still be hers at supper time. On the way back, snow began in earnest and their mounts breathed steam as if all were dragons. They made Winterfell by dusk with eyelashes stiff as needles and cheeks that hurt to smile. A boy ran from the Emporium by the gate with a letter that had slid under the door and found its way to Jon as if the ink had known him. The hand was one he recognized from the way it kept its lines tight, as if the letters feared to fall down the page. Bowen Marsh. The seal was the wall's simple black. He read it walking to the hearth with Ghost ghosting him. The direwolf's paws soundless even on frozen stone. It was apology and warning knotted together. The watch had not broken when he left. Men did not shatter simply because a boy's shadow was removed from them, but cracks had widened. The Shadow Tower wanted grain and men and sent only their worries in exchange. Eastwatch had seen odd fires out upon the hard sea. A fishing boat came back with no men and with the fish still in the bottom frozen in their stiff silver curved shapes. They found footprints on the unmanned side of a half-collapsed stable at Queen's Crown. Barefoot prints that should have shown pain in every step and showed instead nothing. The last page was only a sentence. "We have had white ravens from the citadel enough to line the rookery. Winter has been declared in ink enough times to make a book." Jon folded it carefully and tucked it in his belt. Later, he went to the rookery himself and looked at the white birds in their dark room. They blinked like moving snow and clicked their beaks as if tallying sums. The maester, old Chael, who wore his chain the way a man wears a memory he has to look at to recall, came and said hesitant words about cold and foul disease and whether they had enough lamp oil. Jon said no to that last and yes to more of the rest. He sent ravens north with short words. "We will send grain. We will send men." Hold. He could not carve more out of a night than that. He had Davos with him in the solar over maps the next morning, the smudges of men's mittens having made mountains where there were none, when a horn sounded 3 notes thin and anxious from the gate. A moment later came a running man with cheeks raw from the wind. At his back hovered Manderly's Ser Marlin with his heavy-lidded frankness and his hand on his sword hilt not from panic but habit. "Ship?" the runner panted, though the word wasn't quite right with winter tying the rivers and sea into knots. "From the east." It came under rag and bone, like a dead thing that hadn't the courtesy to lie flat. "She bears the merman and a cutwater carved like a bearded face. Davos is aboard." "Davos is here," Davos said dryly, reaching for his cloak. "A Davos?" the man amended, flustered, and then, with a certain gratitude at being corrected. "A boat with a Davos and a wolf child and a wildling woman and a beast as big as Sin." The hall filled on the pull of such words. Jon went to the yard with his breath like smoke and his heart like something that had been sharpened in 3 slow strokes. The river gate had been cleared and rebuilt and the sluices kept honest. Beyond it the water choked and muttered as if arguing with its own ice. The boat that nosed through was battered and patched and had a look about it of having been asked to do more than boats like to do. At the prow stood a man wrapped to the nose in sealskin with eyes that had looked at more than their share of bad weather and worse men. Davos Seaworth climbed off the deck behind him because Davos would make certain that if there were 2 of him in Winterfell, there would be a quarrel and the one with the better memory would win. Osha came first because of course she did. Her hair was a tangle, her furs hard with salt, her eyes wary and hot both. She set her boots on Winterfell stone the way you set a burden down at last, and then, almost shyly, put a hand to the wall as if to ask whether it remembered her. Behind her, no, not behind, never behind. He came beside her because he did not walk beside anyone. Came a boy. He had the stark look, but cast sideways, wilder, as if a sculptor had taken the same chisel to rougher rock and liked the roughness more than the smooth. He had Ned's long face if you let a winter wind roughen it, and Rob's chin if you took gentleness out of it and whitened it with cold. His hair fell in knots like an animal's pelt. His eyes were a green-brown like deep water under ice. And shaggy dog. The wolf was huge and black as a hall without candles, with a coat that ate the light. He came off the boat as a shadow steps off a wall. Men drew back in a ripple because fear is a river always ready to flood its banks. Ghost stepped forward of his own accord, and the two wolves look at each other the way two winters might look if they could see themselves. Rickon Stark, no longer the babe hunting in kitchens for apples. Not a man, not yet. Looked at Jon as if deciding whether to snarl. He lifted his chin hard. Then, just as quickly, the chin trembled. He turned his face into Osha's sleeve and hid for the space of 3 breaths. When he brought it out again, there was a ferocious will to his mouth, and something old and true and small like a knife his father might have kept in his boot. Jon went to one knee, not like a man with a crown to place on a child's head, but like a man with a knot to untie with his whole body. Snow stung his skin. He did not brush it away. "My lord," he said gently, "if you are Rickon, then I have your hall in hand. I have kept it warm as I could. It will be your fire." Rickon stared at him hard and then, with the speed of boys and wolves, came 2 steps forward and put his palm flat on Jon's face as if to test if it were made of the same stuff as stories. His fingers were cold and small and perfect. "You smell like smoke," he said, almost accusing, almost relieved. "I do," Jon said. "It clings once you've lived by it." Rickon's mouth quivered again but did not break. He looked past Jon to the yard, the broken places patched, the boys drilling with sticks, the women hauling water, the men mending harness by the smithy of the man who had been a man in his grandfather's time and somehow still was when you needed him. His eyes went to the tower that had been home and to the godswood that was more than trees. "Where is Bran?" "Far," Jon said, "because lies rot faster in winter. Alive, I believe. Learning things I do not know. I would go for him, if the world allowed me to without wasting what I can hold here." He waited. "Where is your wolf?" Rickon's chin came prickly again in its pride, and he flicked his head, indicating Shaggy Dog without looking, which was a boy's way of showing he knew where everything was in his world without needing to turn. The wolf huffed and lowered his head and stepped 1 slow pad forward. Ghost mirrored him without thinking because there are old agreements in blood that men do not write and wolves remember. The 2 touched noses once, and in that touch Jon felt something settle in the yard that had rattled for too long. Osha came to Jon then with a frank look that had never asked pardon and would not start now. "We bargained for the boy's life in places where bargains aren't honored," she said. "He's wild because he had to be. The rock eats men's sense, skagos they call it. There are men there who would fight a winter just to see if their spears splinter. There are others who would rather eat you than talk to you. We found one who would talk. Davos found him more, with that mouth that makes silver out of words. We had to go places he didn't like. We had to do things I won't tell you. But we brought him. You can kick me out when you don't need me, but do it quick, because if you wait I'll make the choice first, and take the boy with me." "You brought him home," Jon said. "I don't kick people who bring me my family." He looked at Davos. The smuggler's face was thinner and the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper, but his mouth was the same line of grim patience. "You did it." "It was a close-run thing," Davos said, and the words bulged with all the things he did not say about fish-tailed coats and knives that wanted to do their own thinking and a feast where the meat had come too easily. "We bought a treaty with food and with steel and with the promise that the boy would not forget that he had sat by their fire. I would not borrow trouble by going again." "You will not," Jon said, and his voice made a place in the hall where the notion could sit. "You'll eat, you'll rest, and then..." His eyes cut to Manderly's Ser Marlin, who was watching Rickon with the same hungry relief that a man shows a ship with a light aboard. "You will help me with letters to your fat lord that say, 'Your loyalty has a face to kneel to now.' We will give him pies to eat if he likes, and oaths to keep if he is brave enough." They had no ceremony that morning. Sometimes you put a boy by a fire and that is enough, right? Jon gave Rickon a room H. He had slept in himself once when the world had been simpler and loneliness a single shape instead of many. He set guards outside not to keep others out but to keep the boy's courage in. He put Osha in a room across the corridor with a latch that stuck and a view of the yard that would make her feel the world's foot on the hall step at every sounding board. He took Davos to the kitchens himself and found him a bowl that had been set aside with the respect a household learns to give to men who come cold from the river. Davos blew on the steam and did not hide his pleasure at the heat. "I could stand a pie myself," he said, and then coughed because some jokes are too sharp to swallow whole. "I will tell Lord Wyman his envoy is greedy," Jon said. "Tell him he's right to be," Davos said and ate. Afternoon brought the expected and the unexpected. Ser Hosteen Fry had not died in the snow. He came to the walls with 80 men who had learned to ride in winter by falling off and climbing back on. He shouted old nonsense about oaths and blood that made the men on the battlements smile without meaning to. Jon sent a man to hear him close enough that arrows would not jump from the cold to temperance. He told Hosteen that the North had a Stark again, and that if he wished to talk of weddings he could talk to Rickon when he had hair for a beard. Hosteen bellowed a curse that fizzed in the cold and rode away with that pride that some men mistake for hunger and that only starves them. The unexpected arrived in the shape of a raven from Carhold. The seal was broken and repaired again, as if carried in a glove and taken out when a man's courage wavered and then steadied again. It bore the mark of those Karstark men who had not gone with Arnulf to sign their names to Roos's parchment. The words were simple as worn antler. "If Alice is truly wed as lady and has a hall to stand in, we will bring her our oaths. If she is a puppet with snow under her boots and no earth, we will break the strings we can find. We will not kneel to Stannis. We will not flay. We will not forget who stole Torrhen's crown with a quill. Send a man we can trust to stand for our eyes." "Send me," Alice said, so quick it was nearly the same sentence as the reading. Her eyes were bright and her mouth was set like a door propped with a bar. Jon looked at her, at Sigorn, at the places on the map where the rivers climbed and fell. "You go with 10 men who would die for you and not make a speech out of it," he said. "You go with an Umber who can smell a betrayal under snow the way a hound smells a fox under leaves. You go with letters that say what we can do and refuse what we cannot. You do not sleep in any hall but your father's until the snow tells you to, and even then you have one man wake while the other sleeps." "I will go with my husband," Alice said. "You won't go without him," Jon agreed. "And if he forbids you, I will forbid him." Sigorn did not smile. He looked at Alice as if the world had given him something that required care, and he enjoyed that requirement. "You will go at noon tomorrow. Tonight we feast as small as winter allows." If the feast was small, it still had weight. Meat that had been saved for such a night came to the tables. The last of a barrel of pickled apples found a bowl for itself. Someone produced a wheel of cheese that had been hiding since autumn began to darken afternoons. There were no singers worth the name, but there was a drummer who found the heart of the hall and made it beat loud. Manderley's men did not drink too much because Ser Marlin kept account as careful as Lord Wyman's ledger. The Umbers tried to drink too much because that is how Umbers measure their weather. They fell short only because Godry Faring and his few Queen's men were as thirsty as remembered sin. Melisandre ate little and watched the flames without staring at Jon, which was a kindness he marked. Osha sat with one foot hooked under a bench. She kept her eyes on the boy and on the men and on the wolves in equal measure. Shaggy Dog lay under the table like a slumbering storm, and Ghost lay nearby with one eye half open, which is how wolves pretend at peace. Before midnight Jon rose and made no great speech. He spoke to the tables as one speaks to a field before it is reaped, not to make it grow faster but to let it know you see it. "There is more winter yet," he said. "There is Roose at the Dreadfort. There are men who will decide in the morning to be either brave or clever, and we will live with the choice they make. There is the wall and what stares at it. There is this hall and what it asks of us. There is a boy in that room, his chin cut toward Rickon's door, who has a father's face and his own will. We will make the world hold the truth of that. Eat, sleep, wake to work. They woke to work. Alice and Sigourney left with 10 men and an umber named Enger who had a nose like a hound and a habit of humming when he was thinking. Davos wrote letters with his crabbed hands, and John added a line or a word where needed, the way a smith taps the rivet heads after the fixes sound. John sent ravens to Last Hearth and White Harbor, to Deepwood and Bear Island, to Barrowton and Oldcastle, and every small holdfast whose knight had ever sent Winterfell so much as a goose at Michaelmas. He told them, "If you have a boy who can hold a spear without dropping it, send him. If you have a woman who can cook in cold, send her. If you have a smith who can make a nail that doesn't split the wood it bites, send him. If you have nothing but prayer, keep it there. We'll take the warmth." He sent Moors to ride the east bank of the Weeping Water and make the men who watched Roose count faster than they had. He sent Tormund's archers, stubborn and amused as ravens, to the north track to fall upon any supply sliding south like a bad thought. He sent Manderley's measured men to talk to the carters and teamsters who might be tempted by bolt and silver, and to tempt them with something firmer: food for their wives, safe quarters for their children. He sent Godry and a few Queen's men not to fight but to stand in a hamlet near the Dreadfort and count men without looking like it. "And if you see a flayed man's banner come storming out to frighten sheep," John told them, "remember that banners don't bleed." He kept Theon close not because he trusted him completely but because trust is a muscle and you cannot make it stronger by letting it sleep. Theon ate in the hall now, not near the fire and not near the door but in a place that saw both. He slept in a chamber with a window and a latch that worked and guards outside whose spears were firm but not unkind. Twice in the second week he woke screaming. The second time John went to him with a lamp he carried himself. "It does not end when you wake," Theon said, sweating in the cold. "He comes as if he were in the room, and then I wake to find the room is worse because of it being empty." His laugh was a rasp. "I don't know why I didn't die." "Because you didn't," John said, which was an answer of a sort. "Because you brought a girl out of a yard into a hall. Because you can open a door in your head that stays shut for others who aren't brave enough. Because the gods, old or new, like to make their waits confusing." "I don't know either." He set the lamp down. "Tell me again about the Dreadfort's posterns." Theon did, and what he did not know he guessed, and what he guessed he said clearly so a man could weigh the grain from the chaff. There was a drain that ran under the kennels and out to the Weeping Water. In autumn it stank like the arse of a giant with a sour belly. Now in winter it froze and thawed at the river's whim, which is worse because the smell is trapped until it bursts its prison. There was a sally near the kitchens that a small, quick man could open if a large, slow man distracted the guard. There were chambers under the east wall where a boy could learn to hear footsteps change with the hour and know which footsteps meant leather and which meant iron. Theon knew less than he wanted to about where Roose slept, because Roose changed beds like a man changes shirts when he fears lice. John listened and heaved the maps into new shapes in his head. He could batter the Dreadfort until he had only splinters and bleeding hands to show for it. Or he could let snow and fear batter it for him while he used knives that did not shine in sunlight. On a gray morning that glued breath to beards, a man from Barrowton rode into the yard with the easy seat of someone who had never trusted a saddle to do what he could do with his legs. He had a simple message tucked under his shirt. A man who called himself Arnulf Karstark's son had tried to make a winter bargain with the Dreadfort and had learned that Roose's quill moved only inward. He had returned to his men with one ear and less hope, and now he wished to speak. Alice and Sigourney had reached Carhold and opened the gate not with pleas but with the weight of her standing under the banner. Men had seen her and remembered, because memory is a citizen of the North. They had locked her enemies in a room with a window too small to crawl through, and had not fed them with anything softer than words. Carhold sent men. "Good," John said, feeling the board tilt just so. "Tell Lady Dustin to keep her men on their horses until the river rises. Tell Umber to knock on the door until the hinges feel like giving. Tell White Harbor to shake purses in places where men like to dream of spring." He sent the man away with good salt fish and a new cloak. A cloak is worth more than a coin in some houses. The first skirmish near the Dreadfort came in a dusk as thin as old soup. Tormund's boys fell upon a line of sledges headed south like a string of bad decisions. The men with them fought as folk do when paid in food and fear, with bitterness and spurts of strange courage. 3 died under the shadow of a boulder that had rolled from the hill a century prior and decided to join the fight. 2 more ran. The drivers put up their hands and then, after, put down their hands to carry meat back to the camp whose fires they had watched like wolves themselves. The Umbers did not waste breath on cheers. They counted what they had taken and what they had lost and made the sum move north in frozen sacks. Roose sent a letter written in a hand so neat it seemed proud of itself. The words were precise and clean and had the poison o' winter apple hides. He did not claim Winterfell yet. He called Jon Lord Snow, and that alone was a small victory that tasted of old broth, thin but sustaining. He said that Ramsay had gone off on some youthful caper, and he regretted any inconvenience caused to the citizens of Wintertown by the boys' enthusiasms. He said that peace would be had if Winterfell remembered the law and let those who were appointed by the king keep their places until spring, when all civilized folk spoke of things without knives. He made a careless joke about Shaggy Dog by name, which told Jon that Roose had ears in the town or at the gate. Jon answered by sending him nothing at all. He sent a letter to Lady Dustin instead. If the men in Barrowton who listened to Roose's whispers wanted to come and look at a boy, they could. He would not keep them from breathing deep of Winterfell's smoke and deciding where they wished to draw their next breath. Let them see a wolf. Let them see a Stark. Let them report a truth whose taste they couldn't sweeten on their master's tongue. They came, 3 small parties on 3 different days. Men in winter leathers and women in tighter wrapped wool. Faces wind-burnt and stubborn. They came wary. They left with their mouths set in a different line. One man cried, not sobbing as at a loss but with the contained tears that a man's pride allows when he sees a thing he thought he had lost. One boy reached out a hand and Rickon let him touch Shaggy Dog's flank and pulled it away quick as a thief. The boy laughed and then clapped a hand over his mouth as if to keep the laugh from breaking anything. Men's choices are their own, but you can set a table they can choose at. By the 2nd week of such visitors, Godry Faring came to Jon with a queer humility bending his neck. "Your boy has more power than any sword," he grunted. "He should be watched and guarded." "He is," Jon said, "by a woman who bites harder than most dogs and by a wolf that does not fear the dark." He let Godry swallow that and then added, "And by me." It was not all parley and letters. Sometimes winter gives you a straight line to the thing you must do. Late one night a man ran up from the gate with snow in his beard and panic in his feet. A farmstead 2 miles south had gone quiet. The smoke had stopped from its chimney. The dogs had not barked. Jon gathered 6, no more, and went because leaders should know the shape of their own land when it suffers. Ghost went without needing to be told. The farmstead's door was open on its hinge. The snow had not drifted far in, which told Jon the wind had been easier on them than men had. The hearth was cold. The beds had been slept in and left as if pulled out of. A pot of porridge had frozen into a sculptor's idea of breakfast. The barn held animals that shifted and blew steam, skittish and alive. The yard held prints that were not men's and not wolves and not bears. They were barefoot, as Bowen Marsh's letter had said, and the toes were wrong. Jon crouched and stared and felt the hair on his forearms bristle under wool. He had seen such prints north of the wall when a man's courage is the only lamp lit. He swallowed, stood, and was glad that he had sent the letters and the grain because someone would need to eat while others sharpened steel in the right kind of grimness. They found the family in the copse a quarter-mile away, for huddled beneath a shawl of branches and snow, alive, half-frozen, with eyes that had seen too much night. "They came and looked with blue eyes," the youngest said in a voice that had been stolen from a sparrow. "They didn't blink. Ma said they wasn't people." Jon nodded and gave them a sled and a fire and told them to sleep, and after he had them in the hall he went to the godswood and pressed his palm to the tree as if asking whether it remembered other winters like this. It did. The godswood remembers how men stand. That is its habit. He sent a raven to the Shadow Tower and another to Eastwatch and a third to the Night Fort just because he wanted the old stones to have a letter addressed to them. He told them the dead were walking nearer and that any man who had been weighing whether to come south to hide in a hall should instead sharpen his blade and send one brother to Winterfell for food and another to the wall for orders. He did not try to command the watch. He was no longer its lord. He set his hand to being the North's now. When news came from Carhold, it came in a woman's script that had learned letters by watching men and did them better. We have the gates. We have the loyalty of men whose breath still runs, and some whose breath stopped when they tried to block us. We have the bones of my father buried where fools will not find them easy. We have the wind at our backs when we speak your name. We will come before the next full moon if the snows do not bar us. The letter smelled faintly of smoke and birch sap. Jon read it twice and sent back a scrap of cloth torn from one of the old Stark banners that had survived in the crypts, folded in a strip of fur. Let the touch be as good as ink. The dread fort bled slowly. Its fires burned lower. Twice men tried to drive cattle through and the umbers cut the tail and head off the line until the body knew not where to run. Once a band of Boltons came out with white cloaks draped over their mail like clever boys hiding in a snowbank. Tormund's archers put black feathers in their white and made them magpies. Godry's count grew less neat. He liked that. It meant the work was work. In the third week, Theon came to Jon with a strange quiet on him, like snow that falls straight down without wind. "Let me go in," he said. Jon looked up from the map and at the face that had been kicked into new shapes. "Alone. With two. No more than three. We take the drain when the river moves. We come up under the kennels and open the door for a dog to come to heel. It will be less than pretty. It will stink. But I have walked in stink longer than most. If you are caught," Jon said. "I will die," Theon said simply. "If I am not caught, Roose will have to move before he means to. Either way, the rope tightens." "You do not need to die to make amends," Jon said. "You are not going to be spent for a lesson." Theon laughed softly. "If I die, it will be because I do not know how to live with what I was. If I live, it will be because you gave me something to do with it." He spread his hands a little. "Let me find a door and open it. It is the one thing I have always known how to do." Jon glanced at Davos, who had materialized like a shadow that insists on standing and not merely following a man's feet. Davos said nothing. His eyes made the weighing easier. "Take Anger Umber," Jon said. "Take the then boy with the scar like a river and his spear that hums when he moves it. Take a rope and knives that do not shine." He did not say luck. Luck does not like to be named when you need it most. They left that night, 3 men in the river like secrets. Ghost watched from the bank and did not complain because he understood work. Jon did not sleep. He walked the hall and the yard and the wall and the yard again and spoke softly to a boy who woke from a nightmare and softly to an old man who didn't and softly to a woman who had her first baby on the way and thought she had forgotten how to breathe. He did not look east toward the Dreadfort because looking does not pull men through drains. Near dawn a horn sounded out there. One low, melancholy note. Not an alarm, not a victory. The sun came up grudging and made a smear of pale on the snow. At noon Anger returned with the then boy and a story in their eyes. They brought no Theon. They brought, instead, a rope that smelled as if it had been kept in a giant's armpit and a piece of iron shaped like a dog's collar. The Umber spat to the side with exaggerated respect for the ground and said, "He opened a door. We opened another. He did not come with us through it." "Dead?" Jon asked, voice flat, because if you give sorrow an edge too early, it cuts the wrong flesh. "Not when we left him," the then boy said in his slow North speech. "We left him with a knife in his hands. He cut a man who called him by the wrong name. He smiled when he did it, and then he did not smile again. He blinked. He will die or he will come. I do not know which. It was cold in there." The rope tightened around the Dreadfort's throat. Jon's raiders, a word to be careful with but accurate, made entries in Roose's ledgers of fear. 3 fires where one had been planned. For missing barrels, a slain courier with a message under his tongue intended for a man whose name had not been written, meaning it carried more weight than the others. Roose answered with walls. He shut posterns, doubled watches, forbade men to leave their barracks without 2 companions and a prayer if they were southern enough to know one. He hanged his cook on a suspicion that soup had not come as hot as it could. Men on the east wall saw a figure on the ice late one night and shouted. The figure did not run, as men do, but drifted, and left no marks they could see by morning. White Harbor sent more grain, and with it sent Lord Wyman's word written in a hand as steady as if it were held down with 3 fat fingers. I have eaten well. Aim to feed better. I have put out word that any man who wishes to eat fry at my table may do so, provided he speaks of it after and before with care. I will not write what I mean by that, as men have taken to reading letters they did not earn. He added, to your boy, I have a ship that will carry him to sea if the land refuses him, and I will anchor it on the winter banks if need demands. John read the words to Rickon not as a jest but to check the boy's eyes. Rickon listened as if sea were a thing he might put in his pocket. I will not go, he said, quiet steel. It is my hall. It is, John said. I meant only to let you know the world is large and full of lights. Then turn them here, Rickon said, and the sound of Ned Stark sat for a moment in his mouth and then went away, leaving Rickon again. The wall wrote too. Bowen Marsh's hand grew more tight and less apologetic. Men had seen blue eyes farther south. A patrol had gone out to the Antler and had not come back. A small fire burned in the haunted forest at night, a thin line that did not warm but marked a path nonetheless. He asked for lamp oil and hard bread and salted meat and men who did not feel the need to talk while they watched. John read it with his jaw nodding and unnodding, the muscle working like a man sawing a green bough. He sent what he could. He put Godry and 2 of his best Queen's men on the trip north with sledges that carried more than they should, and a letter pinned inside Godry's shirt that said simply, Stand. I am. He dreamed of the crypts and woke with the sound of a stone sliding on stone in his ear. He went down the next day with only ghost and a lamp. The Stone Kings and Queens watched him with the same unhelpful love they always did. He stood before Lyanna and said nothing, because she would not have appreciated a speech. He stood before his father and said, The boy is here. He looks like you when he is stubborn and like himself when he is not. He will get us through this because men will have to be cowards to leave him to it, and they are not that. I am going to do something you would not like. You would call it unclean maybe, but this is a winter that would make even your honor put on thicker mittens. When he came up, the hall felt warmer than it had. Warmth sometimes follows confession even if the hearer is stone. 2 nights later, a lantern inside the Dreadfort guttered and went out. To men on the east wall it was nothing. To a patient man with a list of small changes written in his head, it was a bell. John moved the pieces he had been palming for days. Moore's Umber and his raiders came up from the riverbank where the reeds made whispers and went over the low place where the wall met poorly made ground. Tormund's boys sent a flight of arrows against the west postern to turn eyes. Manderley's men in the trees to the south lit 3 little fires in a row, like stars close to earth, the way men who speak without speaking tell each other it is time. Under it all, in the stinking throat of brick, a figure moved, thin, half-sick, broken-nosed, with a knife in his hand and blue ice in his face. It was Theon, or the thing that had been shaped into him, and he carried death like a kind of absolution. The kennel keeper had gotten careless, because fear rots along with bones when you keep it too long. Theon put the knife in the place where a man's shout is born and held him while it died. He took the ring of keys and his hands did not shake. He opened a door. Dogs whined and then fell quiet, recognizing something older than men. He turned another key and Enger Umber came in with a spear that looked like it wanted to be thrown at the moon and the then with his hum. They moved like a song without words. Roose Bolton did not die in his bed like a rat. That would be a mercy to storytelling it did not deserve. He died because he stepped into a corridor to check if the soup was any warmer for a different pot and found a wolf there in a man's shape. He reached for his knife with slow, certain hands. He always moved as if the world had promised to take the time to notice. The knife did not have time. Theon's did. It went under the ribs that had never known work and into the heart that had pumped other men's blood with satisfaction. Roose made a face like a man tasting a wine he had suspected would be bad and surprised to find it worse. "You," he said, not in hatred, but in the clinical interest he had always shown in his tools. Then he said nothing because knives still speak cleaner than men. Could have become chaos. It became, instead, a surrender done in long breath holds. The man in charge of the east wall saw Roose's body carried and felt something leave his knees. He sat down and did not get up. Someone shouted a name and the name did not answer. Doors locked and then unlocked and then swung wild. And in the gaps Umbers came in and Karstarks came in, and Manderly's men walked slowly like starving hunters toward bread. By dawn the flayed man was cut from the pole and burned, and the pink linen, freed of dye by fire, went up like a confession. Men who had lived with Roose Bolton's coldness looked at each other as if to confirm they would never have to do it again. They brought Theon back covered in blood he had no memory of wearing. He had one cut across his cheek that would go ragged if not stitched and give him a smile that never reached his eyes. He walked into the yard and looked up at Winterfell's walls the way a boy looks at a house he was told not to enter. Jon met him there. Neither man spoke at once. "He died," Theon said, and the words didn't taste like triumph. They tasted like a thing he had eaten because a hand had pressed the crust into his mouth and told him to chew. "He did," Jon said. He did not put a hand on Theon's shoulder because some men do not take touch as kindness even when it is meant as such. He did not call him Greyjoy or Reek. He called him nothing and let the name lie where Theon had dropped it. Men will live because he did. Theon closed his eyes. When he opened them there was old sea and new snow in them. "She should have died for me to do this," he said, and Jon understood that he meant Yara or Asha or some other sin with a woman's shape. Jon nodded because there are sins men cannot pay for with any one coin. "Jane lives," Theon added, like a small prayer. "She does," Jon said, "and little by little she will learn to sleep. That is worth as much as a dead man." They hanged 3 men who had flayed in Roose's name and left 2 others to dig the pits for them because there are chores that make better teachers than gallows. Jon took care with the executions. He watched them with his face still and sent the bodies to the ground with the respect one gives to sickness that has finally broken. He stripped banners from the Dreadfort's walls and did not burn them in a rage but salted them and rolled them away, a memory put in a dark place where it could not sour food again. Lady Dustin came with 50 riders the day after the Dreadfort fell, looking as if she had expected to be needed and was annoyed to find herself late to the binding. She walked the halls with Jon in a silence that would have wounded softer men. Finally she said, "Well," and it was a word that meant, "You have done a thing I did not think you had the stomach for. Return my men," she said. "Keep the rest. You may take back what you sent and keep the thanks," Jon said. "The rest is ours, and you're right." He did not miss the amused edge at his own word. He had to learn to mean ours when he spoke of the North, not mine. "Your men will tell you what they saw." "They will," she said, "and when they do I will decide what I think of it." She did not mention bones. She did not have to. Jon saw that the work had changed that ledger without a word. Rickon came to the Dreadfort on the 3rd day with Osha and Shaggy Dog and a dozen guards and would have charged the kennels if Osha had not hooked him by the collar and said a word in the wildling tongue that had more depth than a boy's temper could swim. Jon showed him the hall where Roose had eaten with a small mouth. He did not show him the room where the man had died. He took him onto the walls and pointed at the weeping water, green under gray, and said, "That is a road when it is not a river," and Rickon nodded like one who would run both. They left a garrison at the Dreadfort because a hole must be plugged even when it has been made clean. Jon chose a Karstark to hold the keys and an Umber to count them. He put a Manderly in charge of the stores because men who love their bellies count grain as if they were measuring song. He set a woman from the Bar Rowlands, one of Lady Dustin's 2 who had faces like cupboards that know where every cup is, over the kitchens. He told them, "If flayed men come to your gates, you shoot. If hungry men come to your gates, you feed." They went home through a snow that fell soft as regret and then sharpened at the edges the way regret does when you refuse to learn from it. Winterfell took them in and warmed them and set them to their next list because work is the only thing that quiets triumph before it grows into pride. The words traveled faster now. House after house sent the oaths they had been holding on their tongues for fear of a flayed man's knife. Some came in person and bent the knee in the hall by the fire. Others sent a nephew with a good face and a pledge that looked you in the eye. The Serwins came with salt meat and salt tears. The mountain clans came with boys who could disappear behind a snowdrift like mice and reappear behind your ear like tricks. Lady Mormont wrote a letter that managed to be both insulting and loving at once, promising sisters and a glare. White Harbor sent a ship's bell with a crack in it to be hung in the yard. When struck it made a deep, ruined sound that nonetheless carried, and men found it cheering in some stubborn way. Night did not forget them. The dead pressed harder on the watch and the watch pushed back. Bowen Marsh wrote fewer apologies and more numbers. A small outpost at the night fort had to be abandoned under the eyes of things that were not owls. A party came from Hardhome's direction with hands black to the wrist and mouths that would not open for broth. They died and did not stay dead, and the men who burned them did not eat for 2 days and then ate like men ashamed of their bodies. Tormund came south himself with 60 lean hard faces and stood in the hall and spat in the fire and said, "It's coming." Jon gave him beer and bread and men to take back with him, and the giving did not feel like losing because it had purpose. He found a rhythm to rule that had nothing of pageantry and everything of habit. He rose in the middling dark and walked the walls. He ate small when others ate large simply so there would be meat for a man who had done twice as much work as he had. He sat in the solar over maps with Davos and Manderley's man and whoever else had a head for lines and told them where to put grain now if they wanted men there later. He listened to Melisandre when she spoke of fires that went out and men whose shadows had grown too long, and then he did what made sense to a man who had seen dead things move. He went to the gods wood every few nights and did not ask for anything he could name. He let the stillness do that work for him. One morning when the snow made everything honest, Sansa's name came in a whisper, not a raven. A peddler woman with a back bent by time came through with ribbon and rumor and said that a girl with hair the color of autumn leaves was calling herself Elaine Stone in the Vale and learning men's appetites like a seamstress learns cloth. And Jon listened without moving his mouth and then bought 3 spools of ribbon he had no use for. He took the rumor and folded it and put it somewhere a man keeps hope when he is careful not to spoil it. Stannis wrote from the crook of the weeping water, where he had set his camp as if daring the river to rise and steal his fires. He had taken out 3 small holds that had flown pink flags by telling them he would bite through the pole if they made him and then doing it. He had captured a Fry who could name 20 cousins and none of the gods and a Bolton who had learned to smile with only his eyes. He wanted the North to send him more of what it had, grain, boys, patience. Jon sent him what he could and wrote at the bottom of the letter, "The North belongs to its people. You are welcome if you love it as a thing, not a throne." He signed it Jon Stark and did not feel like a boy making mischief as he wrote. He felt like a man setting a nail where a door will hang straight. Rickon grew in work as much as in inches. He had a tutor now, a woman from White Harbor who had taught Lord Wyman's grandsons to use their sums and their sense, and he had Osha to unteach anything too smooth, and between the two the boy kept his wildness where it belonged and learned to put it on when he needed it as men do with mail. He learned to sit still for an hour while men talked and then get up and ask one question that made 3 men frown and 2 smile. He learned to hold a small knife and slice bread for himself without leaving a finger on the table. He learned to whistle for Shaggy Dog in a way that would bring him and not bring him at once. He learned to call Ghost and have the White Wolf come or not come as Ghost decided. The wolves learned each other the way rivers learn each other when they merge. They kept their color for a time and then, slowly, they were only water. On a night when the aurora walked its green fire across the northern sky like a god's banner, Jon stood on the wall and thought of names. He thought of Ned, who had carried honor with a weight that had bent his spine and kept it straight both. He thought of Robb, whose laugh had gone ahead of him like a hunting horn, and of Bran, whose quiet could wrap around a room like a cloak. He thought of Arya, who would come in like a thrown knife and find her chair. He thought of Sansa, who would turn the hall into a place where men's words softened because they wanted to please the air. He thought of Rickon, who stood already with his hands on the table and his eyes wide open. He did not think of himself for long. When he did, he saw a man who had become useful. That was enough. The next day, a raven came from Bravos with a small black streak across its white back, as if the sky had borrowed a pen. Justin Massey had found the Iron Bank's patience and woken it. Money would come like spring water, stingy and clean. Sell's words would follow. Men with strange faces and contracts that would have to be watched as one watches fresh snow for the weakness underneath. Stannis would be pleased and less pleasant. The Red Woman smiled without teeth and said something about shadows moving in a brighter light. Jon told her, very politely, that if any fires were to be lit in his hall for gods or for games, they would be lit by his leave. She inclined her head and said, "The Lord of Light likes to make his own door," and Jon answered, "This is my house." And that was that, for the moment. In the end, the settlement of the North had less trumpet and more ledgers than a singer would celebrate. Land had to be measured and seeds set aside, and boys weighed for their shoulders and their knees. Arrows needed fletching, and there were never enough feathers. A new cooper made new barrels, and old oathbreakers were given two choices and took the one that let them breathe. Men who had loved Roose got used to not hating him once they had food and a fire and no one watching their backs for an excuse to cut them. It was not justice in a song. It was justice in the way bread is honest. They took the Stark bones back from Lady Dustin in the end. She made no ceremony. She had them in a good room, not a damp one. She stood by and watched as they were wrapped and bound against the trip and said nothing cutting. Jon thanked her and meant it. She nodded because she was a woman who liked thanks to be given and to end there. They set the bones in the crypts with the care of men handling something that could break the shape of their own hands if they were clumsy. Rickon stood beside Jon and watched with big eyes and did not fidget. When the last stone slid into place, it made a sound like a door closing against the wind. Winter did not leave, settled like a cat in the best chair. The dead pressed and were pressed. The living breathed and kept breathing. The North did not forget to be itself. Jon walked out one dawn when the world was so cold that the wet in his eyes tried to become stars, and he set his hand on the black stone of the keep and felt his palm answer. Ghost stood beside him. Inside, men stirred. He thought of a boy under a hill of snow with a wolf in his bed, of a man's voice calling him to dinner that smelled of onions and venison, of a girl with a needle taking a stitch through night and day alike. He thought of what had been done and of what would be asked. He went into the heat of the hall. There was porridge and a plate of something sweet for the boy because Osha had stolen a jar of honey from a man who owed the hall more than he owned. There was a list of names on the board where Davos had pinned them. There was a letter from Bowen Marsh with fewer words and more need. There was a map that now had more little wolf heads on it than he would have believed possible a year ago. There was a woman from Bear Island with arms like a deer's hind legs standing over a boy's stance and setting his foot 2 inches to the left. There was an old man from the Bar Rolands teaching a girl to count with beans. There was the smell of men who had washed recently and actually liked it. Jon took a breath and began his day. The wolf beside him rumbled contentment. The boy upstairs would soon be a man. The godswood would be there tonight. The wall would wait, not for him, but for the men and women whose lives his house held up like a shield. He would send what he could. He would keep what he must. He would kneel again in the crypts when the weight felt like too much and get up feeling equal to it again. He would be a Stark because the hall needed one and because the name fit like a well-made glove when you got used to it. He would be Jon because he could not be anything else. He would stand because standing is what the North does when winter asks its questions, and because when he stood he felt the ground under him answer back. Snow kept falling. The fires kept burning. The wolves slept and woke and hunted and returned. The letters came and went like crows. The men on the walls looked out and saw blue sometimes and did not let it bend their knees. The hall beat, steady as a heart that has learned not to rush. And out beyond all of it, the long night that had seemed a story in boys' mouths began to move toward them, slow and sure, as if it liked to see men ready. The North watched it come with eyes that did not blink, and Winterfell warmed the air in a way that made breath look like proof.